This is an interview with Arnold Judson. It's December 21st, 2007. I'm Forrest Larson in the Lewis Music Library. It's my honor and privilege to have Arnold Judson for an interview today. He has a bachelor's degree from MIT. Pardon?
A master's degree.
You also have a bachelor's degree, though, right?
Bachelor's degree.
Right, you have a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from MIT in 1947 and a master's degree from MIT in organizational behavior in 1948. You're also a pianist and composer. The main purpose of this interview is to talk about your life in music while at MIT and beyond. But before we get into that, can you briefly summarize your professional career in business management?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, actually, really started with my graduate studies at MIT. I changed what I thought I was going to do when I went to graduate school, because it was a major shift from chemical engineering into a new field, which at that time even did not have its title yet. It was called, the program was an experimental program lodged for convenience in course 14, which was the economics department at the time. But there were only about a dozen of us in this graduate program, started by Douglas McGregor, who wanted to integrate the social and behavioral sciences with industrial relations. And at that time it had no title. It was called, the program was officially labeled Economics and Engineering, but it had nothing to do with either. And what attracted me to this program was that I had McGregor as an undergraduate psychology professor, and he was wonderful. And I heard that when I came back to MIT from a year of meditation in the Navy between my junior and senior years, I realized when I came back that I really didn't want to be an engineer after all. And I had heard McGregor was starting this new program, and several other people involved in the program were people that I also had some undergraduate contact with in extra sort of humanities and other related courses. And that attracted me to this program, although I didn't really know what I was getting into. But once I did get into it, it was obvious that this is really what I wanted to do. And so when I completed the master's degree, it wasn't at all clear what application one could pursue in business at the time. And it struck me that maybe the field of human resources, or personnel as it was called then, was kind of a ripe field, because it was not professional. It was usually staffed by people who had tried their hand at other managerial functions in organizations and had failed, and then they were put into the personnel department. So that seemed like a underdeveloped field, and I discussed this with McGregor, and he agreed that this was a ripe area, and he gave me some very good advice, which I followed, and that was that if I wanted to get into this field, I shouldn't go directly into it, but I should spend a couple of years getting some experience as a line manager to find out what life was really like at the lower levels in organizations. And I applied and was accepted for a program, training program at U.S. Rubber Company in Providence, which led me to a position as a production foreman in the golf ball department, which was a very funny kind of situation.
And that would have been 1949?
48.
48,
yeah.
yeah.
This was the summer of 48. Okay. And that was very convenient because I had just gotten married, or I was about to get married, and my wife, who was at that time at Brown University in Providence, that seemed to fit nicely. So I spent 2 years with the U.S. Rubber Company as a production foreman, and when I was promoted to general foreman, I decided it was time to move on. And I really felt very strongly that this advice from McGregor was really first class. And so I then, through the MIT placement office, heard about a position at Polaroid Corporation, which at that time was a small company of about 380 people. They had shrunk from their wartime activities and had just brought out the camera, picture-in-a-minute camera in 1948, and were poised for major growth. And they had not a personnel function at the time, and they asked me if I would be interested in setting one up, which was an absolutely perfect situation for someone young and inexperienced, but filled with lots of ideas and so on. So it was a terrific experience, and my boss at that time was vice president of operations, who was a former executive of General Electric, which at that point was a leading company in managerial professionalism. They had invested a lot of money in training people and so on. And Dave Skinner, who was also an MIT alum, was kind of my mentor in the early days at Polaroid. And I ended up spending 12 years at Polaroid. The first 5 was setting up and running the personnel function. And then I got kind of bored because the rapid growth kind of forced most of the attention or resources be put on hiring, selection, and placement. And after you've done that for several years, it became a little mind-numbing. So I decided to go back into manufacturing management, and I was selected to run the first coating plant in Waltham, which was a new facility for Polaroid. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I was approached to set up a corporate training and development function, which was non-existent, had been non-existent, and something that I had been very vocal about advocating for. And I said I would do that, provided it was not part of the personnel function. So I was allowed to do this as independent of the personnel function, and I had a ball because I positioned this new function as kind of an internal consulting operation, and which gave me a lot of latitude and a lot of freedom in applying innovative ideas, all of which were supported very much by the management group at Polaroid. So it was 12 very happy years, and I got very intrigued with consulting through this experience, and I set up a little part-time consulting operation on weekends and evenings with a colleague at Polaroid, and that made my interest in consulting even more strong. And my wife and I used to read the New York Times Sundays, and were very taken with the travel section, and my income was not sufficient to support a lot of travel at that time, particularly with a growing family. And we thought that maybe a good idea would be to live abroad for a while. And I saw one Sunday an ad for a New York consulting firm that was just setting up operations in the UK. And I applied for that, and 6 months later was selected to be, I think, the second or third employee in this office, the Emerson Consultants. The Emerson Consultants is one of the oldest consulting firms in the U.S. Harrington Emerson was a colleague of Frederick Taylor, who's infamous in terms of applying inventing industrial engineering and applying those ideas very vigorously. And the Emerson consultants were really following in that mode, except the guy who was running the UK operation was a deviant from the typical Emerson consulting operation, and he was his background was cultural anthropology, and he had just achieved a real breakthrough in Britain in a very innovative union management collaborative project at the Folly refinery of Esso Petroleum Company. And that had gotten big publicity in Britain, and on the strength of that, Emerson decided to build an operation in the UK. And so he was put in charge of that, and he was the one that was recruiting for it. And what attracted me, the ad was a very unusual ad in that it talked not only about professional qualifications but cultural interests, and made a big play for a very diversified person with very diversified interests, particularly in the cultural area. I learned later that some 1,500 people applied for this position, and that's why it took 6 months to between the time I responded and the time I was hired. And we sold our house in Concord and moved our family to London, where we spent the next 4 years. And this was the first really full-time professional involvement in consulting, and I found that I really loved it, and that was really the beginning of the rest of my career. Initially, the focus was on helping large organizations improve productivity through innovative approaches, particularly involving union management collaboration. And I led a very successful follow-on project also with Esso, but in a totally different area, and that was distribution. And that too got a lot of publicity and was very successful, and several other projects followed that. But after 4 years, we decided that we really felt we were getting out of touch with what was going on in the U.S. This was driven home to me when I discovered that I understood the cartoons in Punch, and I didn't understand the cartoons in the New Yorker, which I continued subscribing to, and that was a very sobering epiphany. So we decided to come back to the U.S., and I applied for and was given a position as a senior consultant with Arthur D. Little in Cambridge. And I spent 10 years there. The first 5 was following pretty much in the same kind of consulting that I was doing with Emerson in the UK, but with U.S. companies, mostly large, and several of them international organizations. And then I got very interested in a new area which was just developing, and that was strategic planning. And Arthur D. Little did not have a professional practice in that, and 2 other colleagues of mine from Emerson had followed me to Arthur D. Little. And the 3 of us collaboratively developed Arthur D. Little's practice in strategic planning. Except that what we were doing differed from our competitors in that we were much more focused on the hard part, which was actually implementing the plan. But implementing the plan meant that you needed to concern yourself with that right from the very beginning of plan formulation. And so our approach differed from our competitors in that we tended to do it with large groups of key managers at different levels in the organization, not just the top people, but those people, involving those people who would be crucial to successful implementation as well. So typically we worked with groups of anywhere from 20 to 35, and we developed a whole process which was very participatory and focused on trying to build understanding and commitment to the plan as well as a quality plan. And that really kind of formed the basis of the rest of my career. And after 10 years at Arthur D. Little, my most crucial colleague and I decided we should leave Arthur D. Little and do this on our own. And so we set up our own shop in Boston, and had two other younger guys join us from Arthur D. Little.
What's the name of that organization?
And that was the Berwick Group, was and that operated for about 5 years. But we've had problems with our two younger colleagues because there was generational differences in terms of priorities of interest, not professionally but personal, and they were became pretty clear that these were irreconcilable differences. And so my senior colleague and myself, my senior colleague was also a product of the same graduate program that I was in. He was in it a little bit after me. His name was Dan Gray, and he also was an MIT alum in graduate school. And so we formed Gray Judson, and that became Gray Judson Howard when we added another senior colleague a little later on. And we were really quite successful. We grew to about 15 professionals and operated until the early 90s when Dan retired, and I decided to retire shortly after that. But I continued kind of solo consulting for several years after that. And I really didn't stop working with clients until the early 2000s. But I've continued on a voluntary basis with the Executive Service Corps, working with nonprofit organizations, and I'm still doing that, but at a pretty modest level of intensity.
Your website mentioned that you had worked with some performing arts organizations.
Yes, this is with the Executive Service Corps, particularly.
So which groups have you worked with?
Let's see. I worked with a dance company, and worked with
which dance company was that?
Oh God, I think they've since folded, but I don't remember the name of it. That was several years ago. A theater, the Coyote Theater, I worked with, and worked with the Strand Theater. They're officially called the Elizabeth McCormick something or other. Also, a performing arts organization that's kind of a producing organization in Natick called the Center for the Arts in Natick. And also, let's see, who else did I work for? Yeah, those are the major arts organizations. Also, a museum in Beverly, the Beverly Historical Society and Museum.
The Strand Theater, where are they based? I'm not familiar.
They're in Upham's Corner in Boston.
Okay.
And they're also a producing organization. I mean, the city gave the Elizabeth McCormick the rights to use the Strand Theater for like $1 a year kind of thing. And then that was a venue, and they filled it with a very wide range of activities.
So kind of going back in time a little bit, can you, just some basic biographical questions. What year were you born and where were you born?
Yeah, in 1927 in Brockton, Massachusetts, on the day that Lindbergh landed in Paris. That was,
Tell me your parents' names and their professions and interests that they had.
Yeah, my father was Moses Judson, and he was a superintendent of a shoe parts company. They made rands and inner soles and various pieces that went into shoes. Brockton historically was a center for high-priced men's shoes, and there were a lot of sort of suppliers that grew up as manufacturers in the area as well. And this was a smallish company. I think they employed about 250 or so people, called Caroline Becker, and the founders of this company were relatives of my mother's, and they employed my father to run the shop.
And your mother's name? And
her name was Fanny Becker, a maiden name Becker, and she did not work. She was a housewife.
That's a noble profession.
Yes, right.
It's often forgotten.
Right.
Did they have interest in music?
Yeah, my father did. He came from a fairly large family, and I think there were 5 brothers and 3 sisters. And the eldest, my father was the second oldest, and his older brother, Solomon Judson, was the music and art critic for the New York Morning Journal, which was one of 3 Yiddish papers in New York City. And he was the first of the family to come to the States, a little, I think, about 1899 or something of that order. And he was a writer initially, and the newspaper sort of moved him into a variety of positions, but one of them was music and art critic, and he sort of continued to be that.
Was he musical at all? Did he sing or play an instrument or anything?
No, but he was very interested in music.
Yeah.
And he had an extensive record collection. He lived in Flushing, Long Island, and we used to visit there quite a lot. So he sort of adopted me as his favorite nephew. He did not have any children of his own, and so I have memories of listening to records at his place in Flushing from very early ages.
So what were some of his interests musically in his record collection? Was it lots of things?
Yeah, it was lots of things. It was a lot of opera. And I also had an aunt, not by marriage, who lived in the same 3-decker that we lived in Brockton in my early years. And she also was a big opera enthusiast, and so I got exposed to that at an early age. But I think my mother's interests were more in the theater, and she was an amateur actress, and she appeared in local productions of Yiddish plays in Brockton. At the YMHA, and my father liked to listen to music on the radio. We did not have a record collection when I was young, but what happened? We had on this 3-decker, we had a big porch, and there was a swing that my father, who was a cabinet maker, on the side. It was a professional cabinet maker before he went into this shoe plant. And he built a swing for me on a porch. We're talking like I was 2 to 3 years old, and I used to spend a lot of time in this swing, and I used to sing a lot, and I made up songs, and so it was this that attracted my family's attention to my musical capabilities at a very early age, and when I was 5, they connected me with a piano teacher in Brockton who was very good.
And what teacher was that?
Pardon me?
What was the name of that teacher?
Yeah, Oppenheim. Ruth Oppenheim. And so she was my first piano teacher until I was about 8. I think even longer than that, 9 or 10. So it's about 5 or 6 years. And she was a very good teacher for a beginner. And so I thrived. And I sort of immersed myself in the piano right from the beginning, because my parents were the household that I lived in was not a very happy one. It was an arranged marriage. It was my father's second marriage. His first wife died in the influenza epidemic after World War I. And the second marriage came about 7 or 8 years after that. And my mother was brought over from Poland by her family. It was her brother that was one of the two owners of this shoe factory that employed my father. My father originally lived in New York, and then when he was married, he lived on a farm in Connecticut with the relatives of his first wife. And when my mother was brought over by her brother, who by that time was already successful as a manufacturer, this was all done with the idea of getting her connected with my father. And temperamentally, they were very different. My father was a very withdrawn, kind of silent man. And I always felt that he was very different from the rest of his brothers and sisters in his family, who were all very successful, very outgoing. And my father was not. And matter of fact, the family referred to him as Poor Mo. And he was extremely intelligent and very capable, but his personality sort of undermined him and was not able to really capitalize on that. My mother, on the other hand, was a very outgoing person, sort of the life of the party, joie de vivre kind of woman. And the marriage was not a happy one, because there was really... my father was extremely conscientious and diligent and supportive to my mother, but there wasn't a good emotional connection. Furthermore, the household also contained my mother's father and mother, who were very old-school European. My maternal grandfather, was a pillar of the synagogue, Orthodox synagogue, and a real sort of autocratic patriarch kind of person. And so I'd soon discovered that music was a wonderful solution for me, because I could immerse myself in the piano, get a lot of praise for doing so, and it gave me an excuse to have minimal contact with the rest of my family, which was going on around. So I used to practice a lot, like several hours a day. Nobody had to really bug me to practice. It was a ready-made solution.
Were there opportunities to go to concerts and stuff like that?
Well, no, this is the odd thing. Somewhat. The only concerts I remember going to as a kid were sort of the community concert series. I don't know whether you're familiar with that, but this was kind of a, I don't know what the right word is, but it was something that went on in small cities around the country, and it was a system of organizing enough support to attract major performers.
Was this a federal program, possibly?
No, I don't think so.
Uh-huh. So it's maybe a private philanthropic organization?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm not sure what, but anyway, it was not unique to Brockton. Brockton at that time was about 70,000 people, and so it was a sizable town, sizable city, and I remember going, to hearing Arthur Rubinstein. They were able to attract first-rate people. And so those were pretty much, but there tended to be individual recitalists as opposed to symphony orchestras. No symphony orchestras, and rarely chamber music too. It was mostly individual performers, vocalists and instrumentalists.
So was it not until you got to MIT that you heard the Boston Symphony, or did you?
Well, I got taken to the Boston Symphony. We weren't very well off. That was the other thing. We had really very, I would say, sort of middle to lower middle class income, and so money was a major constraint. And but we did have a number of much more well-to-do friends, and I got sort of taken up by one of them, and they used to take me to symphony on occasion.
Did you get to any opera performances then?
No, I wasn't, even though I was exposed to opera early on, I was never that taken with opera.
What about musical theater?
That came later. Yeah. That wasn't until I was at MIT that I got into that.
Okay. So you mentioned your first piano teacher, Ruth Oppenheim, and there's three others, somebody named Heinrich Gebhard.
Yes. Now that was, I reached a point with Ruth that she felt I really should be, moving on to somebody more appropriate than she was. And Gebhard was a famous teacher in Boston, sort of one of the kind of a celebrity type. And so I got connected with him. He was happy to take me on, but he was a rotten teacher, I thought, because he really didn't do much for me. He sort of pretty much let me do my thing, and I didn't feel I got much from him. He was the kind of person who people used to like to brag that they studied with him, but I don't know why.
Did he have a performing career as well? Is that what was his reputation?
I don't know. I really don't know. I was only with him for like a year and a half or 2 years. And then the third teacher, David Stone, who was in Brockton, was a really fine teacher, and he had studied at Curtis and Juilliard, and with Rosanna Levine, and he was a very good pianist and a very good teacher and wonderful teacher. And I thought that was a really good move to get involved with him. And then it was through my involvement with him that I met my wife, because she's also studied with him. And I first saw her at a recital when I was 14 and she was 12. And I was really taken with her because I thought of all the other students, she showed a lot of ability.
Right. And your wife's name is June, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was smitten at an early age, but I was totally hopeless socially, and unable or to follow up with this until my senior year at MIT. We'll get to that later. But anyway, and then when after several years studying with David Stone, he took a position with Curtis as a professor. No, Temple University. And so he left Brockton. And that's when I got hooked up with Willie Appel. Because,
so can we back up just a little bit? Some more questions about David Stone. What was he like as a pianist? Did he give recitals that you heard?
No. But he was a wonderful teacher.
What were some of his kind of repertoire expertise? What kind of repertoire did he emphasize, or did he have any particular composers that he particularly liked that he taught students?
Well, it was very pretty much the standard, 18th and 19th century. No, I think the most contemporary was Debussy. I think. But it was very solid in terms of what he was very well versed. Seemed to me anyway, very well versed in the classical galaxy.
Are there any things that he taught you that stay with you today that you consciously think about?
No, not really.
Not really.
No.
Yeah.
But then my musical education was kind of weird because it was very focused on the piano. And although I was very excited when I went to Boston Symphony and heard other people play, my exposure to music on a broad level was very limited. It was mostly piano music and not a very wide. I never really listened to or a lot of different stuff. I was very sort of immersed in the things that I was studying, but I didn't listen to a lot of other music. It was kind of weird. And that all changed when I came here to MIT.
Wow. So I have some more. So tell me about your studies with Willie Appel.
Oh yeah, well he was he came in when David left, and David sort of brought him into Brockton. Willie was at that time, I think, hard up for money, and so he was eager to supplement his income.
Was he teaching at Harvard at the time?
Yeah. And but Harvard never had much respect for practicing artists. They were into scholars,
Right.
but the people who actually did it were really given not. I was very shocked when I first visited Piston in his office. His office was tucked under the stairwell at Payne Hall.
Wow.
And it was really grotty.
And this was Walter Piston, the composer.
Yeah, right.
So
anyway, Willie was, I think, very. His influence was important because he sort of got me to think beyond just the performing bit. He sort of urged me to study harmony and study counterpoint and that kind of thing, which I did. This is all where I was still I'm a kid, this is all before I was 16. We're talking about here, and my wife also studied with him, and he sort of supported my notion about her when he said she was the only other student of his that he had any use for. He did sort of broaden my horizons a lot by sort of emphasizing that I needed to understand more about the music. It was all so much of what I did in the early days was pretty much instinctual. It wasn't. It wasn't through formal study of structure and that kind of stuff that I did what I did when I was performing. And I started performing publicly a lot when I was pretty young. I think.
You had a recital in 1942.
Yeah, right. But I mean, before that, I performed at, for the local Lions Club, that kind of thing, and short, not major programs, but little bits and pieces at various community organizational events. And I think I started doing that when I was like 11 or 12. And I was very ambivalent about performing. I didn't really pursue it particularly. I mean, it was all, they sort of put the heat on me to do it, and I wasn't overly eager to respond. But on the other hand, I enjoyed the attention and the notoriety, if you will.
So what were some of the pieces at that young age that you were playing at those events?
Well, I had the program for that I did on my formal recital.
But before that, what, like playing for the Lions Club, what kind of pieces were you doing for those things?
Oh, well, let's see. I mean, they were usually fairly short things. Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words, kind of, those several of those kinds of things. Children's Corner Suite, Debussy, not bits of it, not the whole thing.
Right.
Nothing, fairly light stuff. And it wasn't until I gave my formal recital that I sort of got more serious in terms of what I performed publicly. But in high school, I got very involved with music there, and Brockton High School was a very excellent public high school in those days, and they had a terrific music director named George Sawyer Dunham, who directed the Glee Club, and he was then hired at MIT during the war years. And he had just come to MIT when I came here, so it was a natural.
My goodness. I wondered about him, yeah. Backtracking just a little bit with Willie Oppel.
Yeah.
What were some of the kind of bigger pieces that you studied with him?
Oh, I really don't remember. Beethoven sonatas, that kind of thing. He was major on Beethoven. Beethoven was certainly somebody that I loved playing from the early age onward, and still do. So, I guess he was a student of Schnabel's.
Oh,
so
wow.
Yeah, so not surprising that should be a major focus.
Did he introduce you to any Baroque literature, any kind of earlier stuff, given the fact he was also a musicologist? And
not really. Not really. No. I think Beethoven was Mozart and Beethoven, probably the two major things. There's some Haydn.
Any contemporary repertoire with him?
No, contemporary stuff didn't happen until later on.
Were you aware much of what was going on, with current, contemporary classical music at the time?
Not before I came to MIT.
Not before you came to MIT.
No.
Had you started composing at all?
Yes. That started, I guess, when I was around 11 or 12. One other major, I should tell you the major story about my wife connection. When I was 11, my parents wanted to get me a better piano. We had an upright piano, which was okay, but they wanted to get me something better. And it was we answered an ad in the Brockton Enterprise, and we saw this piano, which I absolutely died for. It was a 7.5-foot Mason and Hamlin, and it was an absolutely gorgeous piano. But it was too expensive and too big, and we had to pass it up. And my parents bought me it was a baby grand of indeterminate make, but it was better than the one I had. So this is when I was 11, and the guy who was selling it was going blind, and he wanted to vet who the prospective buyer. He didn't want to sell it to just anybody. So the first date that I had with my wife, we had our paths crossed because her mother took her to some concerts that I gave, and was rumored to have said that's the kind of guy I would like as a son-in-law. This was an apocryphal story. This is before I was 16. And then when I came to MIT, she was at Cushing Academy in Ashburnham, and so on vacation she would come home by public transportation often, and I bumped into her several times on the tube because I commuted to MIT for the first 3 years. And I used to bump into her occasionally. And anyway, we didn't really start dating seriously until I was a senior. And what happened there was I was general manager of the Tech, and one of the guys who was working for me on the Tech was dating a girl from Pembroke, Brown, who was in the same dorm as my wife. And I had lined up this Radcliffe girl that I was dating for the senior prom, and she ditched me about 2 weeks before the senior prom, and I was desperate to get somebody to come with me. And it just so happened that this guy, Bob Kingston, I don't remember his name, mentioned to me, he said one day, just out of nowhere in the Tech office, that I bring you regards from June Brenner, who is at Brown. So I said, gee, well, why don't I ask her? And much to my amazement, she accepted. So she came with me to the senior prom, and they had parietal rules in those days. You know, you had to get approval you couldn't come back to the dorm after 11. So it was too late for her to go back to Providence. So, and she lived in Easton, which was 8 miles from Brockton. So I brought her home and walked into her, for the first time, into her parents' big house. Her father's a doctor, and he had his offices in the house. And walked in this living room, and there was the piano that I had, that Mason and Hamlin that I couldn't buy when I was 11 years old. So I couldn't believe this, and she said, "Oh, would you like to play it?" And so at midnight, I rattled off a few things. And her parents' bedroom was just over the piano on the second floor.
Wow. And
so after I left, she walked into her parents' room, and she said, "Did you hear? That was Arnold Judson playing the piano." And my father said, "How the hell do you think I could have not heard it?" That was the beginning.
When you were in high school, did you sing in the chorus or anything like that?
No. Well, I was accompanist to the Glee Club. And I also, I think, accompanied I don't remember whether I was in the Gilbert. They had a Gilbert and Sullivan Society, and I was involved with them. I think sometimes I did the orchestra on the piano bit, or I think I was in the chorus too. And so I was heavily involved with George Dunham through the chorus, because they had a good chorus and did some good stuff in Brockton.
Were there other musical theater shows in high school that you were involved with at all?
No, just the Gilbert and Sullivan stuff.
were you aware much of what was going on in the musical theater, Broadway and stuff like that at the time?
Not in those days.
Yeah.
No.
Were there other instruments that you played? I mean, I know at
No.
MIT you played timpani in the orchestra.
Yeah.
Did you pick that up in high school? Or?
No. I faked it.
Uh-huh.
It was just an excuse to get into the orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
But
There's been other MIT timpanists who've done the same thing.
Yeah.
So, did you play any chamber music or play with other instrumentalists, company violinists or singers in high school? Did you do any of that kind of thing?
I don't recall doing that, but I did later on. But
Mm-hmm.
not
in high school. Did you play any ragtime or jazz in high school or any?
No,
like
no,
that?
that I got interested in later on.
Mm-hmm.
The other one really big publicity type thing that I did in high school was I accompanied a production of Ballad for Americans. I don't know if you remember that or not.
No.
Oh, this was a piece that was written, during the early days of the war. It was very patriotic, by John Latouche and Earl Sumner Robinson.
Uh-huh.
And it was for baritone, chorus, and orchestra. And I did the orchestra part on the piano. And it was a fairly virtuoso type thing, and so I did that with the Brockton choral group, and that was performed. It was a fairly long piece, and it was the kind of thing that was staged as an event, and because of the patriotic fervor at the time, it went over big.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've got a write-up about that.
So before you came to MIT, what were your interests in engineering and science? And
Well, I was very taken with chemistry, high school chemistry. I always did very well. I was an all-A student. This is no big news as far as anybody who comes to MIT, but I had no problems in terms of getting those kinds of grades with minimal effort. And so I had plenty of time to spend on extracurricular stuff. And sorry, what was the question again?
Your engineering and science interests.
Yeah. So I always did very well in math. Math came very easily to me. And the first, and I had skipped a couple of, much earlier. I had skipped second grade. No, sorry. I sort of was. I sort of skipped second grade and I skipped sixth grade. And so I was much younger than everybody else. So I was just barely 16 when I came to MIT.
Wow.
And so the first real science course I took was chemistry, and I was very this was my junior year in high school, and I was very taken with that, and I set up a little lab in our cellar at home, and I had an arrangement with my chemistry professor who was very supportive, and he used to give me unknowns to analyze and bring back the answers to him. And so I spent a lot of time, sort of extracurricular stuff with chemistry. But that was really about the only... and the other thing I was very intrigued with was airplanes. And I used to build model airplanes and fly them. And I thought I wanted to be an aeronautical engineer. That's what I registered initially as when I came to MIT. And in my sophomore year, the first year is standard for everybody, so there was no opportunity to discover this. But when I started taking some of the required courses for aeronautical engineering, like strength of materials, I hated it. They absolutely turned me off because they were so regimented and formularized and didn't seem to require much creative imagination at all. So I switched, and when I came to MIT, we were on a wartime footing.
That's right.
And there was no vacations. It was 3 semesters a year. And as I said, I was just barely 16 when I came, and so by the time I was 18, I was almost finished with my junior year. And but the war was still on, and so anyway, I'll come back to that. So in the beginning of my sophomore year, I decided to switch to chemical engineering, which I enjoyed much better because that was much less regimented and formularized. And in the chemical engineering courses, most of the credit was given for approach and method as opposed to answers. Very unusual. And it turned out much later that I realized when I went to graduate school. I didn't really come to realize this until I went to work, but the chemical engineering degree training was excellent basis for studying organizational behavior, because there's a lot of parallels between the way organizations work and the way chemical processes work. They're both systems, and they're both very mysterious, because in chemical engineering, you're dealing with tubes and vessels and vats and various unit operations, which you can't really see what's going on inside, and it's all a bit mysterious. You know what comes in and you know what comes out, but you're not really sure about what the hell's going on inside, and so you have to make a lot of assumptions and trial and error approaches to solutions, and that's the way it is with organizations. It's very similar. So I realized that the mindset for dealing with understanding the way organizations work and changing the way organizations work requires this same kind of mindset that chemical engineering does. And so it isn't such a strange switch after all, it turned out. Well, anyway, I digressed.
Yeah. So before you came to MIT, you were a fairly well-developed pianist, at least to a large degree. What were your musical kind of plans for the future when you?
Oh well, yeah. The other thing is because I was sort of a minor celebrity in Brockton when I graduated high school and went to MIT. Everybody assumed that I was really, they didn't know why I was going to MIT. I'm talking about the general public. People would come up and say to me, "Why are you doing this? Why aren't you pursuing a musical career?" And I never for a minute ever considered that seriously, because even at that young age, I realized, first of all, that in order to be successful, it would require an incredibly narrow focus. I would really have to devote myself entirely to music, and at the expense of everything else. And secondly, I had questions about whether I was really good enough anyway. I was not under any illusions that I was some undiscovered genius. I thought I was okay, but I never really thought I was good enough to compete in that world. So I had never seriously ever thought that I was going to pursue a musical career. But I always was interested in doing it as kind of a secondary avocation, and which I did.
Why did you choose MIT, which at the time was fairly more narrowly focused on science and engineering than it is today?
Yeah, because I thought I was going to be an engineer. I mean, my father had studied engineering. He never followed through on it. He went to Cooper Union. it's I was good at math and science, and so I was so unquestioning about that I never applied to any other place. I only applied to MIT, and I was put on the waiting list, which was an absolutely horrible thing that happened. And I didn't find this out until I was in my senior year in high school, and that, I think, happened because of the Jewish quota.
Oh,
which
there was
they
a
had.
Jewish quota.
Yeah. So, I mean, I didn't really find that I was accepted until kind of the last minute. But anyway, that was a kind of a cliffhanger.
Right. So you probably knew about some of the MIT Glee Club through George Denham and other musical stuff that was going on at MIT before you came. You knew there was something?
Yeah, I know, vaguely.
Vaguely.
But as soon as I got here, it was like a whole new world opened up. And even though I commuted, which was a real constraint, I actually spent most of my time here. I would leave home. I took the 7:27 train in the morning, and I would get here by about 8:15. And I typically did not get home until after 9 o'clock at night, because I would do all my studying in Walker Memorial Music Room. And I was heavily involved in all kinds of extracurricular stuff right from the beginning. And so I may as well have lived here, And I did live in Boston in my senior year. But the reason that I commuted was I couldn't afford to live here. And I was on scholarship. I got a hefty scholarship from Brockton High School, and then I got one here as well. And so even though tuition then was only $600 a year.
But at the time, that was a lot of money.
Yeah. But more than half of it was paid for by scholarship.
Wow.
But I made a very conscious decision right at the beginning, and that is that I was not going to try to become an all-A student here. I decided to do well enough to keep my scholarship, but spend my time on other extracurricular stuff. And that was I was happy I made that decision.
So, besides music, what were some of the other extracurricular stuff you did?
Well, I got involved with the Tech right from the beginning, because I was also...
and the Tech, that's the student paper here. Yeah. The Tech, that's the student paper.
Yeah.
Yes, right.
Yeah, I was on the student paper in high school, and I wanted to continue that here. And so I was involved with them right from the beginning. And I became editor and general manager in my senior year. And then I was involved in the Glee Club. I was accompanist to the Glee Club, and I got involved in the symphony orchestra. And then I was in a number of other sort of minor, lesser committee type things. I don't, those things were not significant in my recollections. But the things that heavily involved me, and the Tech show in my senior year.
Right, and we'll get to more details on that.
Yeah.
So during the World War II, MIT was very much on war footing, and as you mentioned, there were 3 semesters a year, and there were lots of special students, and things were very different at the time. And some of the things, the casualties of that, it seems to be some of the musical organizations really struggled with that. The orchestra from the late 40s to the late 30s to the early 40s was sporadic, if it existed at all.
Yeah, I think when I got involved with it, it was being revived.
Right, and there's two people who this guy Antonio D'Almeida,
yes,
and somebody named Ralph Huschke.
No, that's after my time. It was Tony D'Almeida.
Okay. Anyways, the yearbook says that Ralph was also involved in reviving the orchestra. Now, whether again, I'm just going by what the yearbook had said.
That's a name that's totally unfamiliar to me.
Okay. So Tony was looks like he was really the driving force behind that. I found the annual report of the combined musical clubs from 1939. They're talking about the orchestra, and that was the year they disbanded, and they said due to lack of interest from enough students, and it says, to quote them, it has never put on an acceptable public concert without ringers.
And well, that's true. We had ringers.
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
and then they said that they should consider the formation of an intercollegiate orchestra, which was, I thought, interesting. So it was 1946 that the orchestra was revived, and on your word, mostly through the work of Antonio D'Almeida, or as he was known, Tony. Were you involved in any of the work to get the orchestra going? Did he recruit you or anything? Were you involved in that in any way?
Well, I'm not. I'm a little hazy as to whether I know I was involved in the orchestra in 40. I wasn't here from 45, June of 45 to September of 46.
Uh-huh.
That's when I was in the Navy.
Okay.
And I'm not clear whether the orchestra existed before then or not.
It wasn't prior to that.
So I think my involvement in the orchestra was when I came back from the Navy.
Okay.
Just that 1 year with Tony D'Almeida. But I do remember that we did some terrific things. We did a production, performance in Jordan Hall of Haydn's Creation, which is not a trivial piece.
Wow. Was that who was the chorus? Was that the Glee Club?
The chorus and the orchestra.
But which chorus was it? Was it the MIT Glee Clubs? Yeah. Okay.
And I'm not sure whether D'Almeida conducted that or not. But anyway, I played the timpani in that, and I remember that. And then we also did a production of The Messiah.
Right, I've read about that.
Yeah, and
that was the first time it had been performed at MIT, according to what I've read.
Yeah, that was also in 46, I think.
Right.
And we took it on the road, because I remember we did it with the LaSalle Junior College Glee Club in New Hampshire, Lebanon, New Hampshire.
Wow.
So I remember I couldn't get the timpani skins to go down low enough. I had to swab them.
Wow. Those were the days when you had the cranks on the, the rim, no pedals.
Yeah, no pedals.
Yeah. Do you remember what kind of financial support that the orchestra got from MIT at the time?
Absolutely no idea.
Yeah. How were musicians recruited?
I'm sorry?
How are the musicians recruited? Was it mostly MIT students?
Yeah.
Were there any?
Because there were several friends of mine involved in the orchestra as well.
Were there any MIT faculty or staff?
Yes. Some.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Not a lot, but I mean there were some. It was a really motley crew, but I mean. They were good enough to have fun with, I mean, I enjoyed the experience.
And as you mentioned earlier, you usually had to get ringers to kind of fill out the ranks.
Yeah, right.
So
and that was easy to do because, it still is. I mean, Boston is loaded with musicians who are only too happy to have opportunities to play.
Were they usually students from other colleges?
Yeah, that was typical.
Yeah. So tell me about Antonio D'Almeida as a conductor. Do you remember much about him? Just his conducting style, his rehearsal technique, and things like that, and just kind of him as a musician.
Well, he was very enthusiastic. I mean, he had a kind of a Latin temperament. I think he was born in Argentina.
He actually was born. He has French citizenship. He studied in Argentina prior to coming to MIT.
Yeah, well, it's Argentina that sticks in my mind. I don't know much about his background beyond that, except that in those days, a lot of students at MIT came here because they were pressured to do so by their parents, and they really hated being here. And music and other kinds of extracurricular activities were an outlet for dealing with this frustration of being pressured to be here. And Tony was certainly one of those. And he didn't stay after that year either. I don't know how long he was here altogether.
I think it was a couple of years. He left after 48.
Yeah, because I remained. I was involved with the orchestra when I was in graduate school as well. So it was 2 years that I was involved with the orchestra. Right. And it was just the choral society before that.
Right.
Before I went into the Navy.
Right.
But the choral society was pretty active. I mean, it was just men.
Right. Right. At the time, that was they call it the Men's Glee Club.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, right.
And there were two of us. There was another accompanist as well. And some things we played four hands.
Who was that?
A guy named Gustafson.
Do you remember his first name?
No.
I could probably dig that up. So did Tony D'Almeida, did he strike you as somebody who had prior conducting experience, or was this kind of his first?
I doubt if he had. He was a kid,
right?
Like us,
right. Do you know what instrument he played?
No, I haven't a clue. But I mean, he seemed very knowledgeable. I mean, he was certainly good enough to pull it off with us. Right. And I think the musicians respected him. And I mean, of course, the whole music thing at MIT, in all my 4 years here, was amateur.
Right.
And there were no music courses when I came.
There seemed to be one called Introduction to Music that was offered in the Department of English.
That's right. That was by Bill Green, Bill Green, who was an English professor.
Right.
And he did this as a hobby. I mean, it was a side interest of his. But that was the only official music course.
So you mentioned some of the like the Haydn Creation and the Handel Messiah. What are some of the other pieces that the orchestra played?
Well, we played. I remember very distinctly Beethoven's Eighth. We did, and some Rossini overtures, and what else did we do? Some Offenbach, I think.
And Tony was a scholar of Offenbach.
Yes, yes, I know.
He
made some recordings of it.
And did a thematic catalog of his work.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, what was your kind of gut feeling about how well the orchestra played?
Oh, it was sort of ragged, but it was fun, I mean, the participants were. What they lacked in technique, they made up for with enthusiasm. This, as an aside, this has got no connection with this. There's an orchestra in Edinburgh, where my daughter lives, called the Really Terrible Orchestra. And it's made up of, enthusiastic amateurs. And one
Wow.
And one of the performers is a famous writer, Alexander McCall Smith. He plays the tuba and bassoon.
My goodness. Wow. Wow.
Well, anyway.
So, just a couple more things about Tony D'Almeida. After he left MIT, he went to Yale and studied with Paul Hindemith.
Yeah.
And Professor Klaus Liebman, who was the first professor of music at MIT, had previously taught at Yale. Do you know if there was any connection there? Do you know if Klaus had...
I don't know. Because this happened after I left. Anyway,
okay,
so.
I just wondered if you might have known if there was some way that Klaus had helped with that.
Yeah.
And Tony went on to...
It's quite possible.
Uh-huh.
Quite possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was miserable here, Tony. I mean, the orchestra was like his salvation.
Uh-huh.
But I mean, I don't know how he managed to survive being here for 2 years.
Wow. Yeah, Tony went on to have a very distinguished career as both a conductor and as a musicologist. And just a couple things here for the record. He conducted widely throughout the U.S. and Europe. He had posts such as the Portuguese Radio Symphony Orchestra from 1957 through 60, the Stuttgart Philharmonic Orchestra. Okay.
Yeah, and then the Monte Carlo Orchestra.
And said also the Houston Opera from 1969 to 1971.
Yes, that's right. I remember that.
And made lots of recordings of neglected French orchestra music, among many other things. As I mentioned earlier, Klaus Liebman, the first professor of music at MIT, he started in the fall of 1947.
Right.
And he was already in the Boston area teaching at local private schools. And previously he had been at Yale University as the conductor of the undergraduate orchestra. So in the spring of 1947, he was brought in to conduct the MIT orchestra, but he wasn't officially hired.
Yeah, it was part of his selection process. This was a test.
Uh-huh.
To see how he would do, and that's when I performed the Beethoven First Piano Concerto.
Right.
That was done at Ringe Tech High School.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I have some more questions about that in just a minute here. Were there other candidates that they auditioned as well?
Not that I know of.
Uh-huh.
They might have been, but I mean, nobody else did that.
Right.
Nobody else was brought into.
Do you know what circumstances brought him to come to conduct that particular concert?
No.
Uh-huh. So this first concert that Klaus Liebman conducted is you played the Piano Concerto No. 1 in C major, Opus 15 of Beethoven.
Right.
Can you tell me how how your performance went and all that?
Oh, I thought it went fine. There was a recording made of it, and it really kills me that I think I got rid of it because it was on an oversized shellac or vinyl disc.
Mm-hmm.
But because I had no way of playing it.
Oh, wow.
But anyway.
Was this your first time as a concerto soloist with an orchestra?
Well, I had done something at Boston Pops, a tech night at the Pops with the Glee, but it was with the Glee Club, I think. So it was not with the orchestra.
Right.
Yeah, this was the big experience with doing that. Yeah.
Had you subsequently done any concerto playing with other? That was
no. Not for want
Wow.
of wanting to do it. I just didn't have any opportunity.
Yeah. So how did it come about that you were playing timpani with the MIT orchestra? Did Tony kind of come to you, or?
No, I think I volunteered. I mean, they needed a timpanist, and I wanted to play in an orchestra, and so that seemed like a fun thing to do, which I did.
And you played timpani through most of your years at MIT here?
Well, no, actually, this was just the senior year and
the
the graduate year.
I see those 2 years. Yeah.
And then I did it at Brown after that. Well, this is a whole funny story. See, we got married when I got my master's degree. We got married that year, 49. No, wait a minute, 40. I'm sorry, it was a year after I got my master's degree. and that was between my wife's junior and senior year at Brown, and I was at that point working on a night shift at U.S. Rubber Company, the foreman, and so I presented myself in the Brown music department and just hung out. And it was one of these don't ask, don't tell situations. They didn't ask me whether I was a registered student, and I never volunteered. So they assumed I was, a student. So I got heavily involved in all kinds of stuff. I took a counterpoint course, and I took a couple of other courses, and I played in the orchestra, played timpani in the orchestra. And then there was also a resident cellist at Brown at the time named Otto von Copenhagen, and he and I got together once every week to explore the piano cello literature.
Wow! So was that your first real serious involvement with chamber music kind of playing?
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
So what stuff did you play with him?
Oh God, I don't remember. I think it was
probably at least the Beethoven.
Yeah, I think we did
sonatas?
one of the Beethoven. We didn't do any Brahms. Oh, I did. Yeah, I got it. Yes, I did. We did do the Brahms horn trio. I don't know.
Wow!
We got somebody else involved in that. And yeah, that was a very favorite piece of mine.
Wow!
And
so getting back to MIT and Klaus Liebmann, tell me about what kind of conductor he was. That's kind of a vague question, but his kind of rehearsal technique, his stick technique, and just kind of his expectations of the orchestra. And
well, he seemed. I mean, it was a very refreshing experience from my point of view, because he's, for the first time, I really was in the presence of somebody who was a professional, thoroughly professional. Because Tony was an enthusiastic amateur in my mind at the time. And I mean, this was a whole different dimension. So it was a wonderful experience from my point of view, and I certainly had no other bases for judging him. But it was a thoroughly satisfying experience from my point of view.
Did you find him a particularly demanding conductor?
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah. Yeah.
Was he particularly? Maybe not particularly, but working with students who were not music majors, was that initially frustrating for him, or is that something that he?
Yeah, I think he took it in his stride. I mean, it seemed to work out okay. The morale, if you will, of the players certainly seemed positive enough. But I think he did pepper the orchestra with some ringers, and so.
Was he somebody who was, some conductors have a real capacity for patience, and others easily get frustrated. How was he on that kind of scale with the orchestra? Was he relatively patient?
I thought he was. He didn't get obnoxious, and from that point of view. No, I thought it was a good experience.
So Klaus had a real particular interest in choral music. I mean, he was a violinist, but he had a real passion for choral music. This would have been, so by the year that I guess that you played with him, did they do any stuff with the glee clubs?
Not that I know of. No.
Yeah.
But I don't think I wasn't involved with the glee club when I was in graduate school.
I see.
So my involvement with the glee club kind of come to an end, I think.
I see. I have some more questions a little later about the glee club, which we'll get back to. Did you get any sense from Klaus Liebmann what kind of music really was that he really felt passionately about, and his did he express any?
No, I didn't have that. I didn't have that much involvement with him. Other than that one one experience.
I see. All right. So at MIT, at the time that you were here, there was one music course offered in the English department called Introduction to Music. And you mentioned being taught by William Green. There was, according to some other records, there was somebody, Dean Fuller.
Oh, yeah, right. Yes, I remember him.
And according to Klaus Liebman's autobiography, Dean Fuller had a musical background. Do you know if Bill Green?
I don't think Bill did. I think he was an amateur.
You didn't possibly take that course, did you?
No, I didn't. No.
No.
Bill was I liked Bill a lot. He was a real character. He was one of these sort of outrageous, eccentric types, and the students loved him for that. And but I really don't know anything more about him other than that he was very popular.
Did you ever hear Klaus Liebman play the violin?
No.
So when you played for the Glee Club, that was for all 4 years that you were at MIT here?
Well, I was. There were only 2 calendar years. I was 1943 to 1945.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But all the time you're here.
Yeah.
And George Dunham was conductor.
Right.
And it seemed like, according to the records I found, during World War II years, he had come in. There was somebody named Henry Jackson Warren who had previously conducted, but then went off to military service.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, that's just one. Did you ever meet Henry Jackson Warren? Or,
No.
No. So, tell me about George Dunham as a conductor.
Oh, he was very good. I mean, very clear, and was able to explain what he wanted. His communication with the group was very good, and I thought he was a real disciplinarian in terms of being demanding and everything. And I think he had high standards. I had a lot of respect for him.
Do you know what his background was, where
Nope.
he was trained or anything like that?
No.
Was he doing any professional courses, conducting any professional groups in Boston? Do you know if he did anything like that?
Not that I know of, no.
Was he also a pianist?
I don't know.
What kinds of, Glee clubs do a huge variety of repertoire. Was there any particular stuff that he had a particular interest in doing?
No, I don't recall, really. I mean, we did have a very eclectic repertory that we did.
Right.
And, of course, the highlight was Take Me Back to Tech. A great piano part.
There's a yearbook picture that credits George Dunham conducting a small instrumental group. Do you know if he did anything like that?
No, that's news to me.
I don't know if the credit's correct, because I wouldn't recognize his picture, but I just wondered. So in 1945, a women's glee club was started for the first time, and did George Dunham conduct that group?
I don't know. This is when I was gone. So
Okay.
that happened after I left.
I see. When you were at MIT, did you play any chamber music or accompany any singers or anything like that? No. There was a group called the Tectonians, a jazz dance band. Did you ever hear them play?
I don't remember. Maybe at a fraternity party or something like that. It's all very hazy. Yeah, the name rings a bell. And there was also the Logarithms.
Oh, they were going back then. Wow.
I think so.
Wow. That's interesting. I'll have to to
I'm not sure about. I think so. I mean, that name popped into my mind.
It possibly could. They're a long-standing a cappella group.
Yeah.
One more question about the Tectonians. Do you have any impression about how well they played? And did students talk about them? And no. All right. Moving on to the MIT Tech Show. There had been a long-standing tradition at MIT of an annual musical theater production written and produced by students called the MIT Tech Show.
Right.
It had ceased for a number of years,
That's
the
right.
last production being 1936.
Yeah.
According to the yearbook, after that, at this thing called freshman camp, there was an MIT alum, Orville B. Dennison, or Obie as he was known, class of 1911, would sing songs from old tech shows, and supposedly out of this was an inspiration to revive the tech show. Do you remember this gentleman, Orville?
No, the name is familiar, and it's familiar because I think he arranged a book of MIT songs or something. I think.
Okay, I'll look at it. We have some of those collections here. I'll look and this name was new to me as I was doing research.
He was. I remember his name was attached to arrangements, choral arrangements of MIT stuff.
I see. So you wrote the music for the first revived show.
In 47.
Tell me how you got involved in the this production.
Well, it was my idea. I mean, there was two of us were involved. Jack Kiefer and I. Jack was a friend of mine, and he's another, one of these people who were sent to MIT by their parents under protest, kind of thing. And I mean, his interests were mainly literary, and he had he wrote poetry, and that was really what he was interested in. And he and I sort of came up with this idea: let's put on a show.
Wow.
And I got really interested in musical theater when I was in the Navy. When I went to New York and saw On the Town, and that blew me away. The Bernstein. That was Bernstein's first thing.
Right.
And I had been interested in jazz, and the confronting a theatrical experience where jazz, very jazz influenced music was the basis for a show was a very eye-opening experience. And so that really propelled my interest in doing this thing at the Tech Show. And so, and the book for the whole concept of a liberal life was something that Jack and I hatched because it was a radical idea. The whole idea of humanizing MIT, was not in the history at that point.
Right. The yearbook mentions two other people that supposedly were involved in this revival. Somebody named Phil Macht.
Phil Macht, yeah.
Yeah, and Jim Egelstein.
Yes. Well, they were performers. And Jerry Sapolsky.
Okay.
She was the ingenue.
So, but it was you and Jack Kiefer who were the kind of the organizing kind of brains behind this.
Yeah, he wrote the book and the lyrics, and I wrote the music. I wrote and directed the orchestra. I conducted the thing as well. And we did it in Jordan Hall. That was where it was performed.
Wow, and the dates,
it was in the
May 2nd and 3rd of 1948, it says here.
No, 47.
Or, I'm sorry. That's right. Okay, that's the 48 show.
Yeah,
that's right.
Bill Katz and I did the 48 show.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So, what were some of the challenges in kind of reviving this show? It must have been an awful lot of work to...
Oh, it was a colossal undertaking. Well, the big challenge was to devise music that, people could do. Because we're not dealing with people who were particularly musically trained or anything.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the chorus and so on were not. So I had to be very careful about what I demanded of them musically.
Right. And they were people not necessarily involved with the Glee Club, right?
No.
Uh-huh.
Well, some of them were.
Right,
yeah.
but not necessarily.
Yeah.
Can you give a brief summary of the story of this show?
Oh God, I don't remember it. But you have the script.
The MIT archives. There's some sketchy stuff there. We don't actually have the. I forgot exactly. There's something missing there that when I started doing research on this, and I forgot exactly what's there, but I wasn't able to. There's a summary of it in the yearbook. That was the best I could get.
But in there is the libretto.
Okay.
Script.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah. So I really don't remember it too much.
But the premise being MIT becoming a liberal arts.
Yeah,
institution.
but I think it was initiated by the students. It was like a revolution by the students.
Right. There was the whole thing about the humanities at MIT was very much talked about. There was the famous Lewis Committee, the Committee on Educational Survey, which brought about the School of Humanities. So seemed like there was something.
But when I was here, and even in 43 and 44, they had some sensational people teaching in the humanities department.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is before the Lewis Report.
Right.
And the quality of... I got totally swept away by my elective courses in the humanities, particularly in the history of philosophy. And, they had Giorgio de Santillana and Carl Deutsch, who were superb. And, that was one of the things that made me dissatisfied with becoming an engineer, because I got exposed to this stuff, and it was mind-blowing. And that's what also attracted me to this graduate program, because some of these people were involved in the graduate program as well, this experimental graduate program. So there's one thing we didn't get clear about my musical education at MIT. My most important influence at MIT musically was the music library, which at that time was housed in Walker Memorial, and it consisted of the main listening room. There was this lounge room that overlooks the Charles Basin on the second floor, and it had this was in the mid-40s, what was at that time a really high-quality hi-fi reproduction system. It had a big, huge woofer and a couple of tweeters and a good turntable and so on. And then they had an enormous, it seemed to me, enormous collection of shellac 78 RPM, that's the only thing that existed then,
right.
Discs, most of which were in cases in the balcony on the second floor of Walker Memorial. And I literally spent all my time there. All my study time and my time when I wasn't involved in classes or other activities was spent in that room listening to music and doing my homework. And there were a small group of us who used to congregate up there. It wasn't big. It was, we're talking about like a dozen people maybe.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, that's when I began to discover music. I mean, even though I had studied the piano and all that, all I really knew was a very narrow range of piano music, relatively speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And the things that really opened me up were Mahler. They had 12 and 14 record albums.
Yeah.
Mahler's second with Dmitri Metropolis, that was the original recording of that. And Shostakovich.
Uh-huh. And he was hot at the time.
That's right. And that really, I mean, the thing that really blew my mind on that one was that first piano concerto and the first symphony.
Mm-hmm.
And all kinds of other stuff. And I just learned so much from doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I also went to BSO Friday rehearsals. And that was the other major influence in opening up my horizons to what music was all about.
So the music library over in Walker, were there any scores as well, or was it all recordings?
Yeah, they did have some scores, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Not too much.
Did you do much with the score
Yeah,
collection?
some,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you also, in the library there, you must have then also heard Stravinsky and Bartók and stuff like that?
Well, not too much Bartók.
Uh-huh.
There wasn't much Bartók recorded at that time.
That's right.
But Stravinsky, yes, Stravinsky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Oh, Symphony of Sounds was another one that blew me away.
Uh-huh. And then at
and Les Noces and that.
Did the Rite of Spring make a big impression on you?
Yes.
Yeah, it does so many people.
And also L'Histoire du Soldat, the very early recording of that. I mean, these were, first recordings of
right.
a lot of that stuff.
Right. A couple more things. So the 1948 tech show you co-wrote with Bill Katz. Tell me about Bill. What was his instrument, and had he done other kinds of theatrical productions?
Not that I know of. No, he was also a piano. But I not a serious pianist. I think more of a sort of a sing-along pianist. And but he had some good ideas, and he wrote most of it. I only did a few numbers for that because I was in graduate school and I didn't have a lot of time.
So was it pretty easy co-writing the songs with him?
Yeah.
Because sometimes co-writers, they kind of go at each other. And
No.
Yeah. Did you conduct the orchestra for that?
No.
Do you remember who did?
No, I don't. But that had a Parisian theme.
It was called Frère Jacques.
Yes,
right.
Yes. I mean, it had nothing to do with MIT. I mean, the book.
Right. Was there any faculty involvement in the production of the tech shows?
Nope, not that I remember.
I know that in later years there were, but I'm wondering for these two.
Well, there was no faculty. I mean, there was no music faculty.
Right, but as far as just faculty, like I read some reference that William Green had assisted in some tech show productions. It must have been after you were here, and I was just wondering if that reference in this book, it was a very vague reference, what extent that was.
Well, he was certainly not involved in ours.
Yeah. What did Klaus Liebmann think of the 48 show? Did he come? Do you know?
I don't know. I have no idea.
And
see, by that time I was in graduate school, and my involvement in that kind of activity was sort of peripheral, much more peripheral than it had been before. Because the graduate program was very demanding, both in daytimes and in the evening too. We did some very avant-garde experimental stuff. We started one of the very first tea groups in the graduate program, and that met weekly in the evening, and all 12 of us went to that, and we brought significant others with us.
Uh-huh.
And so, there wasn't much time for involvement in undergraduate stuff.
Mm-hmm. So when you were at MIT, did you find time to practice the piano and kind of keep that up?
Well, see, that's the interesting thing. My interest shifted away from performing as soon as I got to MIT. I mean, so my recital that I gave in Brockton before I came to MIT was sort of the high point of my performing life. Mm-hmm. And because I had a lot of ambivalence about performing anyway, I really was much more interested in composing. Mm-hmm. And so I didn't spend much time practicing after that, mm-hmm. after I came to MIT. I did enough to sort of keep my fingers limber and learn what I had to learn to do the Glee Club stuff and so on. But I never really got into it. I wasn't into performing. Mm-hmm. And I pretty much stayed that way until the 70s. Uh-huh. I was spent whatever time I had for music, I spent more on the compositional end. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We'll get more into this in detail in the next interview, but how did it come about that you studied with Walter Piston at Harvard?
Well, as I said, because I was increasingly interested in composition, I heard about this deal they had in graduate. When you went to graduate school, you could take courses at Harvard, free, and you just had to be accepted.
Right.
So I hied over to Harvard, and I got an appointment with Piston. And I brought some stuff that I had written, and he took a look at it, and he accepted me, much to my amazement.
So tell me about some of those pieces that you showed him.
Oh God, I don't even remember what I showed him, because the stuff I had written up to that point was pretty awful. I mean, I don't know why he accepted me. To be honest, I mean, I guess maybe I showed him the tech show. I don't know. I don't remember what the hell I showed him, because there wasn't that much that I had written that
was
I
it
really
mostly
felt that good about.
Yeah, besides the tech show, was it mostly piano music?
Yeah, it was mostly piano music. Well, it was all piano music. And so anyway, he accepted me, much to my surprise. And the group in his course turned out to be very small. I mean, it was like, I don't know, 7 or 8 of us, I think. And they were a distinguished group in retrospect. The names that I remember was Noel Lee was one of them.
Yeah, who went on to be a very fine pianist.
Yeah, Nicholas Van Slyke.
Yes, right.
Was in my class. Klaus Roy.
Klaus George Roy.
Yeah.
Right.
And then there's a guy whom I've seen around here at various concerts. I keep bumping into him. I can't remember his name. He was in the class. Bert Whistle. Bert Whistle? Yeah.
Harrison Birtwistle?
Yes, he was in the class.
Was the English composer?
No, wait a minute.
Okay. There's a Harrison Birtwistle. He couldn't have been.
No.
He's
there was a name like that, though.
Harrison Birtwistle is much. Probably wasn't born then, but.
No.
I'll have to look. There's a book on Walter Piston's students.
Yeah.
And I'll see if I can dig up some names for you.
Yeah.
I'll look around.
But anyway, that was the group, and it wasn't. There were only two other names that I can't remember. And me. It was, and I mean, it was all we did was write stuff and bring it in with performers, and we talked about it, and he commented on it. I mean, that was really what the class was about. It was very little structure to it.
Did he also, from time to time, bring in other pieces just to analyze and to kind of show you things?
No. No, it was all stuff we worked on and brought in and talked about. It was a very informal class, and I learned a lot.
Wow. So in our next interview, I'll have some more questions about Walter Piston, and I think this is a good stopping point. And I want to thank you very much for coming in today. This was really good. Okay. Thanks.
Are you getting what you want? I mean,
yes, this is very good.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Good.